we meet again. Come in, get comfortable. I'm your wee dark librarian, keeper of places people don't stay, listener to warnings that were never written down, and someone who knows that folklore doesn't only concern itself with beings. Sometimes it concerns itself with behaviour. Tonight we're talking about liminal spaces. Not haunted houses, not ruins, and not places where something dramatic happened, but places that you pass through. Spaces that exist only as transitions between one state and another, one place and the next, one certainty and the one that replaces it. In folklore, these places aren't empty, they're charged, because they aren't meant to hold you. A liminal space isn't a destination. It's not somewhere that you arrive. It's somewhere you move through. And folklore is very clear about one thing. Staying too long is a mistake. Not because something is guaranteed to happen, but because lingering breaks a rule that existed long before anyone tried to explain it. Old warnings about these places rarely sound frightening. They sound practical. Don't stop there. Keep going. Don't wait. Because folklore understands something that modern language struggles to say. Unfinished states make people vulnerable, and places that exist only as crossings were never designed to keep you safe. In Scottish folklore, a doorway isn't just a gap in a wall. It's a line, a boundary between states, inside and outside, known and unknown, protected and exposed. That's why so many customs gather at the threshold. Babies were never left there. They were carried fully across. The dead were lifted cleanly over it, never dragged. And guests were either welcomed inside or kept out entirely. Standing in the doorway was discouraged, not because it was impolite, but because it was indecisive. And folklore treats indecision as dangerous. To stand halfway inside a house is to belong nowhere. You're not fully sheltered, but you're no longer fully outside. Old belief was that this made people noticeable, not necessarily to spirits, but to misfortune. The house itself was thought to resist uncertainty. Doors were closed deliberately. Thresholds were stepped over carefully. People were moved along, gently, firmly, and without explanation. Children learned this instinctively. If you lingered too long in a doorway, someone pulled you through. The message wasn't fear, it was clarity. Choose where you are, because the in-between doesn't belong to you. Roads are some of the oldest liminal spaces in folklore because they're made entirely out of intention. A road doesn't exist by accident. It exists because people needed to go somewhere, and they kept going. In Scotland, old roads weren't planned in the way that modern roads are. They formed slowly. Feet wore them in, hooves widened them, and carts deepened the ruts. Generations walked the same lines for the same reasons: to trade, to visit, to flee, to return. That repetition mattered. Folklore treats repeated movement as a kind of memory, not conscious or sentient, but persistent. A road knows what it was used for. That's why roads feel different once they fall out of use. They don't become neutral, they become unsettled. Crossroads appear again and again in Scottish folklore because they concentrate choice. They're places where direction changes, intention becomes visible, and hesitation has consequences. An older belief, crossroads weren't dangerous because something lived there. They were dangerous because nothing stayed. That's why criminals, suicides, and those denied burial rights were sometimes interred at crossroads. Not as a punishment, but as prevention. A presence placed there couldn't return home. It would be dispersed, confused, unable to settle. Folklore feared return more than it feared death. A road that no longer leads anywhere is more disturbing than a ruin. A ruin has accepted its end. A road promises continuation and then refuses it. People don't linger on old roads, not because they expect an encounter, but because stopping feels wrong. The land remembers being used. A memory without purpose creates unease. That discomfort isn't supernatural, it's behavioural. Folklore simply noticed it first. In folklore, water is never neutral. It's a boundary that looks inviting and behaves dishonestly. The edge of water, riverbanks, loch shores, tidal lines, is one of the most consistently dangerous liminal spaces in Scottish belief. Not because water's evil, but because it doesn't follow the same rules as land. On land, footprints remain. On land, objects stay where they fall, and on land, the dead can be recovered. Water removes things. Bodies disappear. Tracks vanish. Sound behaves differently, and distance becomes unreliable. That's why folklore places danger not in the water, but at its edge. This is where many of the beings that you already know appear. Kelpies. They don't rise from the depths to hunt. They wait at fords and crossings. River fae. They linger near banks, not midstream. Selkies shed their skins on the shorelines. Places where land and sea briefly agree before pulling apart again. These aren't creatures of water itself. They're creatures of the boundary. The danger isn't sudden. It comes after a pause, after misjudgment, after a moment where movement should have continued, but didn't. One step too far, one moment of trust, one decision made slowly instead of decisively. That's why Scottish water spirits are rarely described as chasing. They wait. They allow you to decide. The boundary does the work. Folklore isn't warning you that water's going to attack you. It's warning you that the water doesn't correct mistakes. Once land gives way, there's no negotiation. That's why old advice around lochs and rivers sounds so practical. Don't linger. Don't play at the edge. Don't stop where the footing changes. Because water doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't hold space for hesitation. Night is not simply the absence of light. In folklore, night is a condition. It alters perception, it softens boundaries, and it removes witnesses. That's why so many things happen after dark. Not because night creates danger, but because it removes certainty. The Banshee appears at night because people are already disoriented. Witches work after sunset because observation weakens. Revenants are feared because illness spreads unseen. And sleep paralysis occurs when consciousness itself becomes liminal. Night places the body in an in-between state. Awake, but impaired. Alert, but uncertain. Present, but less defended. Folklore doesn't describe night as evil. It describes it as thin. And thin spaces allow things to pass through. That's why old advice sounds so similar across cultures. Don't wander alone. Don't answer voices. Don't follow lights. And don't stop moving. These aren't supernatural warnings. They're behavioural ones. Night reduces feedback. You can't see who's watching. You can't tell how far you've walked. And you can't judge distance accurately. Lingering at night increases vulnerability, not because something's going to attack you, but because you can't respond quickly if it does. Night is meant to be passed through. Sleep completes the transition. Dawn restores boundaries. Anything that interrupts that process, insomnia, fear, paralysis, becomes fertile ground for folklore, because the body is caught between states. There's a quieter belief recorded in Highland oral tradition about certain stretches of moorland where lost travellers were never found, not because they vanished, but because they didn't stay where people looked. Searchers would comb the same ground again and again. Nothing. No tracks, no disturbance, no sign of a struggle. Days later, the missing person might be discovered, only a short distance away, somewhere already searched. Folklore's explanation was simple. The land didn't keep those who lingered. It returned them only once movement resumed, once the search passed through instead of circling. This wasn't treated as malice, it was treated as a rule. Do not pause where passage is expected. There's an old story told quietly in parts of the Highlands about a stretch of road that never held anyone long. Not because it was cursed, but because it refused to keep what didn't belong. Travellers avoided stopping there. Horses grew restless. Wheels broke. Lanterns failed without warning. One winter, a man travelling home after dark was forced to stop when his cart snapped a wheel. He did everything right. He stayed close to the road, he kept his lantern lit, and he didn't wander, but he waited. As the hours passed, he began to hear movement. Not footsteps, dragging. Something being pulled along the road behind him, just out of sight. He didn't look. Folklore is very clear about that. When the sound drew closer, he felt a weight settle beside him. Not touching, but present. The man did what he'd been told since childhood. He didn't speak, he didn't turn, he didn't acknowledge it. And when the lantern finally went out, he stood and walked. Left the cart, left the road, kept moving until dawn. By morning, the cart was gone. So was the road. People say it shifted after that. Changed shape. Not physically, but in memory, in use. Because the land didn't want a witness. This isn't a ghost story. It's a boundary story. The man wasn't attacked because he didn't belong. The mistake was waiting. By now, the pattern should feel unmistakable. Liminal spaces are not a category. They're the framework beneath folklore. They explain why so many different beliefs behave the same way. They appear where rules loosen. Witches work where control weakens. Vampires rise, where death is unresolved. Water spirits wait, where certainty ends. Abandoned places feel wrong because purpose vanished. And sleep paralysis occurs when the mind crosses without consent. These aren't separate ideas, they're expressions of instability. Folklore doesn't fear monsters, it fears states that can't hold. States where rules are unclear, where behaviour becomes uncertain, where protection weakens. That's why folklore focuses so heavily on movement. Finish the crossing, complete the ritual, step fully inside, lay the dead properly, sleep or wake, not both. Liminal spaces are dangerous because they suspend clarity, and clarity keeps people alive. When folklore tells you not to linger, it isn't threatening you, it's guiding you. Move through, do not stall, do not remain where you don't belong. Because instability attracts consequences, not necessarily supernatural ones, but very real ones. Folklore didn't invent these warnings, it noticed them. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Not with a monster, but with a pattern. Because folklore doesn't warn us about places for no reason. It warns us about states, about moments where the rules soften and the body or mind becomes exposed. Next time, we'll turn inward, to the body itself, to disability, illness, and mental difference, and how folklore tried to understand bodies that didn't behave as expected. Because sometimes the most frightening boundary isn't a place at all, it's your own skin. Until then, if you ever find yourself somewhere that feels unsettled, don't panic. Just don't linger. Good night.